Hey there. Tonight, we slip behind the heavy velvet curtains of a great Victorian house, past the gilt mirrors and the flickering candles, into the strange and glittering world of a celebrated beauty, a woman whose face is her fortune, her weapon, and her cage, all at once. Tonight, you become the most beautiful woman in the room, the one every eye follows, every painter longs to capture, every mother quietly envies, and every gentleman quietly wants. The most admired woman in England. And, as you're about to discover, quite possibly the most imprisoned. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders go heavy. And let's step gently into a single day in the life of a Victorian beauty. A day spent being looked at, from the moment you wake to the moment you sleep, by a world that adores your face and cares nothing at all for the woman behind it. Congratulations. You have just woken up as a celebrated Victorian beauty. The good news, you have been blessed, or perhaps cursed, with the one quality that your century prizes above almost any other in a woman, loveliness. Doors open for you that stay shut to others. Rooms fall quiet when you enter. Your portrait hangs in the Royal Academy, and your photograph sells in the shop windows, and strangers who have never met you feel that they know you and love you, simply for the shape of your face. The bad news, that face is now the whole of your value, in the eyes of nearly everyone, and you will spend your days maintaining it the way a banker guards a vault, anxiously, endlessly, and in the growing knowledge that it cannot last. For beauty, in your world, is not a happy accident you may enjoy and forget. It is a profession, a performance, and a kind of warfare, and it begins the moment you open your eyes. You do not simply roll out of bed and face the day. You wake to a long, exacting ritual of preparation, because a beauty is never, ever seen at less than her best, and the work of seeming effortless is, as ever, enormous. Let us begin where the Victorians believed all beauty began, with sleep itself and with the skin. You will have slept, if you are diligent, in gloves lined with cold cream or oils, perhaps in a mask, your hands and face anointed against the cruelties of the air. You will rise and submit to the first inspection of the day, your own, in the glass, searching your reflection for the small daily betrayals of the body, a blemish, a shadow, a line that was not there last spring. And then the maintenance begins, and here is where your century's idea of beauty turns from charming to genuinely alarming, because the Victorian beauty is, quite literally, poisoning herself in pursuit of perfection, day after day, and most of the time she has no idea. Consider the great ideal of the age, skin of a flawless, luminous, almost unearthly whiteness. Pale as the moon, smooth as marble, untouched by sun or labor or the common flush of life. A tan marks you as a working woman out in the fields. A freckle is a small catastrophe. A high color suggests, heaven forbid, exertion or strong feeling. So you must be white, 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 and to achieve it, women reached for cosmetics that we now know to be slow poisons. There were face powders and paints whitened with lead, that beautiful deadly metal, smoothed over the skin to give that coveted alabaster finish, and the lead seeped in, year after year, damaging the very skin it was meant to perfect, so that a woman might need ever more paint to cover the ruin the paint itself had caused, a vicious and toxic spiral. There were complexion wafers and tonics laced with arsenic, swallowed or applied to clear the skin and produce that pale, interesting, slightly consumptive glow the age found so romantic. Arsenic, the poisoner's favorite, taken deliberately, in the name of looking lovely. And there was belladonna, deadly nightshade itself, whose very name means beautiful lady, because women dropped its extract into their eyes to dilate the pupils, making the gaze large, dark, dewy, and seductive. It worked. It also blurred the vision, and in time could damage the eyes outright. You would sit at your dressing table and deliberately drip poison into your eyes to make them more alluring, and call it beauty, and so would every fashionable woman you knew. Some painted fine blue lines onto their pale skin to suggest the delicate veins of a fragile, aristocratic constitution. Some enameled their faces entirely, a process in which the skin was coated in a smooth, hard, painted layer that could crack if you smiled too broadly, so that a woman so enameled had to hold her face nearly still, beautiful and immobile as a doll. You are, in short, building a mask, at real cost to the living face beneath it, in service of an ideal that no actual human face could ever meet on its own. And the lengths women went to do not stop at paint. Consider the cheeks, which must show a faint, becoming flush, but never, ever the obvious rouge of a vulgar or fast woman, for the supreme rule of Victorian beauty is that all of it must look entirely natural, as though God himself had simply made you this way. So the rouge must be the subtlest whisper of color, applied with an invisible hand. The lips must be soft and rosy, touched with tinted salves and balms, but never painted in any way a sharp-eyed dowager could detect and condemn. Some women bit their lips and pinched their cheeks before entering a room, to summon a natural color that would not give them away. Others chewed on things, or used tinted papers pressed to the mouth, all in the desperate effort to seem effortlessly blooming. The whole art was deception that must never be caught, to be perfectly, artificially perfect, and to swear, with a clear and lovely face, that you had done nothing at all. Then there was the matter of keeping the skin itself young and smooth, against which whole arsenals were deployed. Women slept in those oil and cream gloves and masks. They applied poultices and lotions of every description, some harmless, some decidedly not. There were washes of all kinds promising to lighten, to soften, to erase a freckle or a line. Some bathed in milk, or in other strange concoctions, to whiten and soften the skin. Some applied raw meat or other remedies to the face overnight. The advertisements of the age groaned with miracle creams and complexion tonics and bloom of youth preparations, many of them laced with the very lead and mercury and arsenic that were quietly doing such harm, for the line between cosmetic and poison was one that almost no one fully understood, and the women who used them paid the price in ruined skin, failing health, and sometimes far worse, all in the name of the smooth pale perfection their world demanded. And here is a bitter irony at the very heart of it. The sickly look itself was fashionable. The pale skin, the dark dilated eyes, the slender, almost fragile frame, the faint air of delicacy, this was, in part, the look of consumption, of tuberculosis, the great wasting disease that killed so many in that century. A real illness became, grotesquely, an aesthetic ideal, and healthy women painted and starved and poisoned themselves to imitate the look of the dying. To be a great beauty was, in a strange and terrible way, to perform a kind of beautiful sickness, and sometimes, with all that lead and arsenic, to perform it straight into a genuine one. And lest you think the danger merely theoretical, the age had its grim and famous proofs. The cautionary tales whispered from one generation of beauties to the next. There had been, not so very long before, celebrated women who had quite literally died of their own loveliness, who had painted their faces day after day with the fashionable white lead until the metal poisoned them through, ruining first the skin and then the blood and then the life itself, so that a woman renowned across her whole society for her beauty might waste away and die young, killed by the very paint that had made her famous. The dreadful logic of it was a slow spiral that trapped its victims. The lead paint damaged and discolored the skin it was smoothed upon, so that the woman, dismayed by the worsening of her complexion, applied yet more paint to cover the damage, which did more damage still, which called for more paint, round and round, thicker and thicker, the cure and the poison being one and the same substance, until the face beneath was ruined and the body with it. The women caught in that spiral could not always see it happening. The connection between the beautiful powder and the failing health was not understood as we understand it, and the advertisements swore the preparations were pure and harmless and good for the skin. So they trusted, and they painted, and some of them paid with their lives, and the fashion rolled on over their graves unchecked. It was not only the face, either. There was the arsenic, taken as a tonic and a complexion clearer, a deadly poison swallowed in small doses in the belief that it brightened the eyes, and cleared the skin and gave that pale, interesting glow, and arsenic, taken so, accumulates, and harms, and can in the end kill. There was the mercury in certain skin treatments, with its own slow toxic toll. There were the gowns dyed that gorgeous fashionable green made with arsenic compounds, that shed a faint poisonous dust onto the skin of the woman who wore them, and the hands of the women who sewed them, sickening both. A Victorian beauty moved through a world quietly laced with poison at every turn, on her face, in her tonic, in the very color of her dress, all of it in the service of an ideal of loveliness, and almost none of it understood for the slow danger it truly was. She was, in the most literal sense, dying for beauty, a little, all the time. And she would have been astonished, and perhaps not even entirely persuaded, to be told so. And we have not even left the dressing table. Your hair must be dealt with, the long, uncut, glorious hair that is a woman's crowning glory, brushed its ritual 100 strokes, oiled, patted, pinned, and built into the elaborate architecture the season demands, often with false pieces and pads worked in to give the required fullness, the whole sculpture taking an age and a skilled maid's patient hands. Your brows and lashes must be darkened, discreetly, for the age frowns on obvious paint even as it demands the effect of it. A beauty must look naturally, miraculously perfect, never made up. So all your artifice must be invisible, which is harder and more anxious work by far than honest decoration would be. The hair alone is a daily labor that would exhaust a modern imagination. It has never been cut, for a woman's long hair is one of her chief glories, and so it falls past your waist when loosed, a heavy mane that must be brushed and brushed, the ritual 100 strokes and more, to draw the natural oils through it and give it its sheen, for there is no other way to keep it gleaming. It must be washed only rarely, an arduous all-day affair of its own, and so between washings it is oiled and pomaded and powdered and worked into shape. Then it is dressed, parted, smoothed, twisted, coiled, pinned into the elaborate style the hour and the season demand, padded out with rolls and false pieces to achieve the fashionable fullness, threaded with ribbons or flowers or jewels for the evening. A great beauty's hair might take an hour and more each day to arrange, and require the skilled and patient hands of a lady's maid who has made the dressing of hair her life's craft. And the styles were heavy and pinned tight, and gave many a woman an aching head by evening. One more small daily suffering folded invisibly into the seamless picture of effortless loveliness. And there was the body to tend, in an age whose ideas of cleanliness were not our own. Full immersion bathing was, for much of the century, a laborious and infrequent thing. Hot water carried up by the canful, a tin tub before the fire, the whole production undertaken perhaps once or twice a week, with the rest of the time a matter of washing in sections at a basin. So a beauty relied heavily on scent to do what soap and water did not. Perfumes, scented waters, sweet powders, pomanders, the whole fragrant arsenal deployed to keep her as delicious to be near as she was to look upon. She tended her hands, kept soft and white and ringed, for a lady's hands were always on display, and a callus or a stain would betray her. She guarded her teeth as best the dentistry of the age allowed, and her breath, and every small detail of the close presentation of herself, because a beauty admired across a ballroom must not disappoint on nearer acquaintance. Every inch of her, head to foot, was a project, tended daily, in the long and secret labor that produced the single seamless effect the world was permitted to see, a woman who simply, impossibly, woke up perfect. Then comes the body, and the corset, and here your figure is laced into the fashionable shape with the usual ruthlessness, the small waist, the smooth line, the breath squeezed away. For a beauty, the figure matters as much as the face, and the tight lacing is pursued with particular zeal. Season upon season, the waist cinched a little smaller, until you can no longer take a full breath or bend at the middle or eat more than a few delicate mouthfuls. You will feel faint by mid-afternoon. You will reach, like every laced lady, for your smelling salts. And you will call it worth it, because the silhouette is everything, and the suffering does not show, and a beauty's whole art is to make agony look like grace. And the corset's harm went far deeper than a day's discomfort, though few women fully understood it at the time. Worn from girlhood, laced tighter year upon year, it reshaped the growing body itself, pressing the lower ribs inward, crowding the lungs so that a tightly laced woman could never draw a full deep breath and was prone to faintness and breathlessness, displacing the very organs of the abdomen, weakening the muscles of the back and trunk that the stays did the work of holding up. The shallow, fluttering breathing at force was one reason fashionable women were forever near to swooning, forever reaching for the smelling salts, forever needing to be revived on a sofa. The famous Victorian delicacy was, in no small part, simply the predictable result of being unable to breathe. A lifetime of tight lacing could leave its lasting marks on a woman's body, and yet the fashion held, season upon season, because the wasp waist was beauty and beauty was everything, and a woman would sooner endure a deformed rib cage than a thick waist. And looming over every beautiful young wife was the great peril that beauty itself could not soften and money could only partly buy away: childbirth. For a married beauty would be expected to bear children, and to bear them again and again, in an age when childbirth was genuinely dangerous, killing healthy young women with grim regularity through fever and hemorrhage, and the simple absence of any real medical help. Each confinement was a brush with death faced without anesthesia for much of the century, without antisepsis, without any of the safeguards we take for granted. And for a beauty there was a second dread laced into the first, a vain and human one. She would scarcely dare confess that childbearing would take its toll on the very looks her whole position rested upon, that the figure would thicken, the bloom would fade, the body would be marked and worn by the bearing of child after child, and the face that had been her fortune would pay the price of her fertility. She was caught, as Victorian women so often were, between two of her century's absolute demands, to be beautiful and to be a mother, and the second was forever quietly at war with the first. To live as a beauty was to live a body under constant strain, laced and faint by day, and facing, every year or two, the real possibility of dying to bring a child into the world. And over all of it goes the dress, the gowns of silk and satin, the crinoline or the bustle, the layers and the trains, the whole magnificent costume that frames and displays you. Some of it is dyed in those gorgeous, fashionable, poisonous greens made with arsenic that gave off their faint toxic dust against your skin all evening. Some of it weighs more than you would believe, so that simply wearing it is a kind of labor. You are dressed, painted, laced, and adorned into a living work of art, and the art, remember, is the point. You are not preparing to live your day. You are preparing to be seen all day by everyone and judged instantly and constantly on the single question of how beautiful you are. And the verdict is never permanent and never finished and must be won again tomorrow. None of it, of course, could be accomplished alone, and so at the very center of a beauty's secret life stood a figure the world outside scarcely thought about at all, her lady's maid. This was the woman who knew the truth behind the miracle, who saw the face before the paint and after it, who knew which curls were the lady's own and which were pinned in, who laced the corset and mixed the lotions and brushed out the long hair at night, who carried away the soiled linen and kept the locked secrets of the dressing table. A skilled lady's maid was an artist in her own right, mistress of hair and dress and the discreet application of forbidden cosmetics, and a great beauty depended on her utterly, often more than on any friend or husband. The two women spent hours together in the intimate quiet of the dressing-room, and a peculiar closeness could grow there, across the great gulf of class that separated them, a closeness built on shared labor and shared secrets, and yet never quite friendship, for one was always the mistress and one always the servant. The maid knew everything and could say nothing. Her discretion was her livelihood. She was the keeper of the illusion, the unseen hand behind the seamless picture, and when the beauty swept downstairs at last, flawless and effortless, it was the maid's long invisible labor as much as nature's gift that the admiring world was applauding. There is a quiet poignancy in that relationship, too, when you sit with it. The maid, often a plain woman or a tired one, spent her days making another woman beautiful, tending a loveliness that would never be praised in her, dressing for the ball a mistress, who would dance while she waited up half the night to undress her again. She watched the adoration from the shadows at the edge of the room, the unregarded author of its object. And she watched, too, the thing the beauty most dreaded and could not see for herself, the slow work of the years, for the maid's honest hands felt the truth the mistress's mirror was lied to about, knew before anyone the first thinning of the hair, the first line the powder no longer hid. In the long partnership of those two women, mistress and maid, beautiful and plain, adored and invisible, the whole strange economy of Victorian beauty was quietly played out every single morning, behind a closed door the glittering world never thought to open. Let us walk through it, then, the long performance of a beauty's day. The morning is given over almost entirely to the making of you, the bath, the skin, the hair, the painting, the lacing, the dressing, hours of patient labor by you and your maid before you are fit to be seen by a living soul. Then come the morning calls, that ritual of brief formal visits, where you appear at your daytime best, exchanging pleasantries in drawing rooms while being quietly assessed by every other woman present. In the afternoon, the great public ritual of the drive out into the park in an open carriage, beautifully arrayed, to be seen and admired by all of fashionable society parading slowly up and down, a living exhibition of the season's loveliest faces. You incline your head to acquaintances. Gentlemen rein in their horses to murmur a word at your carriage. The whole slow promenade is a performance, and you are one of its stars, and you never once let the smile slip or the posture sag, because you are on display every single second. And then the evening, and the ball, which is the great arena where a beauty's powers are most dazzlingly displayed and most ruthlessly judged. You arrive late enough to make an entrance, and the entrance matters enormously. The pause at the top of the stairs, the descent, the moment the room becomes aware of you, and the conversation falters, and the heads turn. A great beauty learns to feel that turning of heads like warmth on the skin. The ballroom blazes with 1,000 candles, or the brilliant new gaslight. The air is thick with the scent of banked flowers and warm bodies and perfume. The music swells, and through it all you move, radiant, the painted and laced and poisoned masterpiece of the morning's long labor, collecting partners and admirers and the envious glances of rival beauties. You dance, though the corset will barely let you breathe. You make light, charming, weightless conversation, careful never to seem too clever. You hold your enameled face just so lest it crack. And beneath the gown, your feet are in agony, and your ribs ache, and you are faint with hunger and the heat, and you would give a great deal to sit down in a cool dark room and be no one at all for an hour. But you cannot, and you do not, because a beauty is never off duty, and the night is young, and somewhere across the room a fresher face has just appeared, and the endless silent contest goes on. And the whole performance was conducted, remember, under a code of manners so elaborate and so strict that it amounted to a silent language all its own, which a beauty had to speak as fluently as her own tongue. There was a grammar to everything. The fan in her hand was not merely for the heat, held just so, drawn across the cheek, open wide or snapped shut. It could carry whole messages of invitation or refusal to an attentive admirer across a crowded room, a flirtation conducted in plain sight that a chaperone might never catch. The flowers a gentleman sent the next morning spoke in their own dictionary of blossoms, each bloom a sentiment, so that a bouquet was a letter, and a letter could be a declaration. The order of the dances, carefully inscribed on a little card that hung at her wrist, was a delicate negotiation of favor and rank, and to grant a man a second dance, or that most charged of all, the supper dance, was to say something the whole room would read. Even the timing of a morning call, the leaving of a card with a corner turned, the precise warmth or coolness of a greeting, all of it was code, and a beauty navigated it ceaselessly, sending and receiving 100 small silent signals an evening, her every gesture freighted with a meaning the initiated could read at a glance. And then there were the jewels, for a great beauty was also, in her way, a display case, a living stage on which a family's or a husband's wealth was shown to the world. The diamonds at her throat, the pearls wound through her hair, the bracelets, and the rings, and the great glittering parure brought out for a state occasion, were not merely ornament. They were a statement of position, a portion of the family fortune worn upon the skin for all to see and reckon. A beauty learned to wear them as she wore everything, with a studied carelessness that pretended such splendor was nothing remarkable, while knowing very well that every other woman in the room was pricing the stones at her ears. To be beautiful and richly adorned was to be doubly looked at, doubly envied, and doubly a target, and the heavy cold weight of all that treasure was one more thing she carried, gracefully, smiling. Through the long blazing hours of a night she was not permitted to find tiring. For this, in the end, is the only real work a beauty has, to be looked at. And the looking is relentless. At every one of those morning calls, and afternoon drives and dinners and balls, you are on display every waking moment, your face and figure assessed, compared, ranked against the other beauties of the season with all the cool ruthlessness of a horse fair. For there is competition, fierce, unspoken, exhausting competition, among the celebrated beauties of society, each watched to see whose looks are at their height, and whose are just beginning, ever so slightly, to fade. You smile, and you charm, and you glide through the rooms as though you have not a care, and all the while you are being measured, and you know it, and the knowing never stops. Some women turn this looking into a strange kind of fame. In the latter part of the century there arose a whole new figure, the professional beauty, a woman, often of no very great rank, who became celebrated across the entire country simply for being beautiful, her photographs sold by the thousand in shop windows, her face known to people who would never meet her, gawped at in the street, gossiped about in the papers. It was a new and modern sort of celebrity, fame for the face alone, and it could lift a woman of modest birth to the very heights of society and the company of princes. But it was a fame built entirely on a foundation of sand, on youth, on smoothness, on the fleeting bloom of a particular few years, and every professional beauty knew, in her heart, that the same public that adored her today would turn its hungry eye to a fresher face tomorrow. And consider how exacting, how minutely catalogued, the standard you had to meet actually was. For Victorian beauty was not a vague matter of being pleasant to look at, but a precise inventory of features, each with its own ideal, all of which a true beauty was expected to possess at once. The forehead high, smooth, and white. The eyebrows finely arched, like the stroke of a delicate pen. The eyes large, clear, and expressive, set well apart, fringed with long lashes, and the rarer their color, the better, a deep violet or a luminous grape prized as a kind of treasure. The nose straight and neat. The mouth small, a rosebud mouth, the books called it, for a wide mouth was thought coarse, the lips full but not too full, soft and rosy. The teeth white and even, no small accomplishment in an age of cruel dentistry. The complexion, of course, that flawless poreless white touched with the faintest rose at the cheek. The neck long and white as a swan's. The hands small, soft, white, with tapering fingers. The figure tall but not too tall, with sloping shoulders, a full bosom, a tiny waist, and a graceful carriage. And the whole crowned by that abundant, glossy, never-cut hair. A woman was measured against this catalogue point by point, feature by feature, and found wanting at every place she fell short of it, and almost no real human face could meet the whole list, which is precisely why the paint and the powder and the poison were pressed into such desperate service, to forge the features nature had declined to grant. And the cruelty of the standard lay not only in its exactness, but in its contradictions, for it asked of a woman things that could not all be true at once. She must be pale, as if she never went out, yet bright-eyed and blooming as if in radiant health. She must be slender and fragile and delicate, yet able to dance till dawn, sit upright for hours, and carry pounds of gown and corset and jewels without a sign of strain. She must be perfectly groomed, painted, and arranged, yet appear entirely natural, as though she had simply risen so. She must be alluring enough to draw every eye, yet so modest and innocent that no one could fault her for it. She must be accomplished, able to sing and play and converse and move with grace, yet never clever in a way that might unsettle a man or seem to compete with him. It was a standard built of impossibilities, and a beauty spent her life threading the needle between them, knowing that to fail on any side, too pale, and she looked ill, too bright, and she looked common, too plain, and she was nothing, too alluring, and she was fast, was to lose at the only game her world had given her to play. Because that is the shadow that lies over the whole glittering performance, the cold thing at the bottom of the jeweled box. Your beauty is the source of all your power, and your beauty is dying, a little, every single day. There is no cosmetic, no corset, no clever trick of light that can stop it. The clock that ticks for every Victorian woman ticks loudest of all for a beauty, because she has further to fall. The debutante dreads the fading of her first bloom over a few short seasons. The celebrated beauty dreads it as a kind of death, the slow loss of the one thing the world has ever valued in her. And so she watches the mirror with mounting dread. She studies the younger women coming up behind her. She reaches for stronger paint, tighter lacing, more desperate measures, and the very poisons she uses to preserve her looks hasten, in the end, their ruin. To be a great beauty is to be handed, at the height of your glory, a sentence of slow, public decline, and to spend your fairest years already grieving for them. Picture what waited at the end of that decline, for it is the quiet tragedy beneath all the glitter. The reigning beauty of one decade became, in the next, a woman the young no longer turned to look at, and the loss of that attention, after a lifetime of being its constant object, could be a kind of bereavement almost too heavy to bear. Some faced it with grace, finding, as their looks faded, other things to be, a wit, a hostess, a matriarch, a woman of influence whose power had quietly outgrown her face. The luckiest had married well and wisely, while their beauty still commanded a high price, and could settle into a secure and comfortable middle age, their youthful loveliness a fond memory rather than a vanished livelihood. But others could not let go, and their stories are the saddest of all, the aging beauties who painted ever more thickly, laced ever more tightly, clung ever more desperately to a youth that would not stay, becoming, in the cruel eyes of society, figures of pity or even ridicule, the very thing they had spent their lives terrified of becoming. The world, which had worshipped them, could be merciless to a faded beauty, mocking in age the same woman it had adored in youth, as though the fading were a failure of hers, a thing she ought somehow to have prevented. And the cosmetics took their revenge in the end. The lead that had given the skin its alabaster youth left it gray, ruined, prematurely aged. The years of arsenic and mercury and belladonna exacted their slow toll on health and sight and life itself. The very arts a woman used to preserve her beauty hastened, in the cruelest irony of all, its destruction, so that a great beauty in her later years might find her famous skin coarsened and discolored by the decades of poison she had smoothed upon it in its name. She had spent her youth defacing her own future face. The mask had eaten the woman beneath. So the mirror, which had been a beauty's truest friend in youth, became in age her cruelest enemy, and she learned to dread it, to search it each morning with mounting fear, to mark each new line and shadow and slackening as a small defeat in a war she could not win. Some, like one of the women you will meet tonight, came at last to cover the mirrors entirely rather than face what they showed. For when your whole self has been your face, the loss of that face is the loss of everything, and there is no harder thing in all the gilded world than to have been, once the most beautiful woman in the room, and to be so no longer, and to know it, and to go on. And here, too, is the cruelty nobody names at the ball, that all this admiration is not the same thing as respect, or safety, or love. To be the most desired woman in the room is also to be the most exposed to the bold stares, the murmured remarks, the gentlemen who feel that beauty is a kind of public property, a thing offered up to be enjoyed. A beauty is pursued, and gossiped about, and pestered, and her reputation hangs by a thread all the more fragile for the attention she draws. She is adored as an object, and rarely known as a person. Men compose poems to her face, who have never once asked her thoughts. She is, in the most glittering way imaginable, profoundly alone, surrounded always by admirers, and seen, truly seen, by almost no one. And over all of it hung the great terror of a respectable woman's life, her reputation, that invisible, priceless, fragile thing on which everything else depended. For a beauty drew danger to her reputation precisely in proportion to the admiration she drew, and the rules she lived under were merciless and entirely one-sided. A gentleman might flirt, pursue, keep mistresses, sell whatever wild oats he pleased, and lose nothing by it. A lady had only to be talked about, not even to do anything, merely to be the subject of a whisper, and her whole standing could collapse beneath her. A beauty therefore lived under a constant, exhausting surveillance, her every word and glance and dance partner noted and weighed by a society alert for the smallest slip. She could not be alone with a man not her husband. She could not let an admirer's attentions go a half-step too far in public. She could not afford a single rumor, however false, because in the brutal arithmetic of Victorian respectability a woman's virtue was assumed lost the moment it was questioned, and once lost it could almost never be recovered. The very beauty that won her all that attention was thus also a standing threat to her, drawing the bold and the predatory and the merely gossiping, any one of whom might, with a lie or an overstep, bring the whole gilded structure of her good name crashing down. And when a woman did fall, when scandal did attach to her, deserved or not, the punishment was social death, swift and near total. The doors that had opened to her beauty slammed shut. The friends who had courted her looked through her in the street. She was dropped from the invitation lists, cut by the very people who had flattered her, exiled from the only world she knew, while the man involved in her ruin walked on untouched. This was the abyss that yawned beneath every beauty's dazzling performance, the reason the surveillance and the caution never relaxed. She was dancing always at the edge of a cliff, and the more brilliant her position, the further she had to fall. One of the women you will meet tonight fell exactly so, was named in a scandal so public it played out in Parliament and the press, and was cast out of respectable English society forever. What the world expected was that she would then fade away in shame and penitence, as a fallen woman should. What she did instead was something the world never forgave and never forgot. There were, of course, the portraits, for a great beauty must be captured, fixed, displayed, and the painting of her became an event in itself. You would sit for hours for a fashionable artist, holding a pose, your loveliness studied and flattered and translated onto canvas to hang in a gallery or a great house, admired by strangers, discussed in the papers. To have your portrait exhibited at the Royal Academy, and to see the crowds gather before it was a kind of coronation. And later in the century the camera joined the brush, and your photograph could be reproduced and sold and pinned up in 1,000 parlors, your face made into a possession the public could buy. It was flattering, intoxicating even, and it was also a strange surrender, for once your image belonged to the world felt it owned a piece of you. And the woman behind the famous face shrank a little smaller behind it with every print that sold. And there was a particular kind of beauty the age came to worship through its painters, the artist's muse, the woman whose face launched not a portrait but a whole vision of loveliness, copied and recopied into picture after picture until it became the very ideal of the era. In the middle of the century a circle of young painters arose who turned away from the conventional prettiness of the day and sought instead a new kind of beauty. Women with masses of loose, untamed hair, strong jaws, full lips, long sculptural necks, and a brooding, far-away, soulful look in the eyes. Stunners, they called them, in their private slang. And they found these faces, often, not among the great ladies of society, but among shopgirls and seamstresses and women of the working poor, plucked from obscurity for the accident of an extraordinary face, and made immortal upon canvas. A young woman discovered behind a milliner's counter might find herself transformed into a queen, a goddess, a tragic heroine of legend. Her likeness hung in exhibitions, and admired by thousands who would never know her name. But the muse's fate was its own cautionary tale, and not always a happy one. To be a painter's ideal was to be adored as a face and a symbol, while the living woman behind it was often used up, overworked, and finally cast aside. The most famous of these muses sat for endless hours, sometimes at real cost to her health. One celebrated model is said to have lain for hours in a bath to pose as a drowned heroine until she took a chill that did her lasting harm, and her own life, threaded through with the painters who immortalized her, could end in sorrow, in illness, in early death. The face went on shining from the gallery walls long after the woman who wore it had faded or suffered or gone. It was the beauty's predicament again, in another key, to be turned into an image the world treasured, while the person was quietly spent in the making of it. Beauty could lift a poor girl onto the walls of the Royal Academy, and leave the woman herself as poor, and as powerless, and as alone as it had found her. And always there was the competition, the quiet war among beauties that no one ever spoke of aloud, and everyone waged without cease. In any season, in any circle, there was a reigning beauty, the acknowledged loveliest, the one whose entrance stopped the conversation, and beneath her a whole ranked order of rivals, each watching the others with smiling, ruthless attention. Whose looks were at their peak? Whose were just beginning to go? Which fresh young face had appeared this season to threaten the established queens? A beauty learned to read a ballroom, like a general reads a battlefield, to gauge in an instant where she stood in the invisible hierarchy of faces, to feel the tiny shifts of attention that meant her star was rising or, the cold dread of it, beginning, ever so slightly, to set. It was exhausting, and it was lonely, and it pitted women against one another in a contest none of them had chosen, and none could ever finally win. And here we must be honest about why that contest mattered so terribly, why women would poison and starve and lace themselves half to death to win it, because beauty, in your world, was very nearly the only real power a woman was permitted to have. Think of what was denied her. She could not vote, nor hold office, nor enter most professions. She could rarely control her own money once she married. She could not, for much of the century, even keep her own earnings or her own property. She was barred from the universities, shut out of public life, expected to be quiet, obedient, and ornamental. In a world that gave women almost no levers of power at all, beauty was one of the very few, a currency she could actually spend, a force she could actually wield. A beautiful face could win a great marriage. and with it, position, wealth, security, the only kind of advancement a woman could hope to make. A beautiful face could turn the head of a powerful man and, through him, touch the levers of real influence she could never grasp directly. Beauty could lift a girl from obscurity to the heights, as it lifted more than one woman in our stories tonight, in a way that nothing else available to a woman of her time could match. So the desperate pursuit of it was not vanity, or not only vanity. It was, in its way, ambition, the ambition of women who had been handed exactly one tool with which to shape their fates, and who used it with all the cunning and effort and ruthlessness that men poured into careers and conquests. The marriage market priced a beauty high. Her loveliness could be traded for a title, a fortune, a great house, a name. Mothers groomed their lovely daughters for it as carefully as a trainer grooms a champion. And a girl understood, young, that her face was her future, that the bloom of a few short years would determine, more than anything else, the whole long shape of her life. No wonder she guarded it like treasure. No wonder she dreaded its fading like death. It was, quite literally, the capital on which her entire future was built, and it was a capital that wasted a little, irreversibly, with every passing day. And because the stakes were so high, the lesson began early, earlier than you might think, and went deeper than mere instruction. A lovely girl learned almost before she could speak that her face was special, that it drew smiles and gifts and a softness from the grown world that her plainer sisters did not command. She was told she was pretty until it became the truest thing she knew about herself. She was dressed and shown off and praised for her looks at an age when a child can hardly tell where the praise ends and the self begins. By the time she was old enough to understand it, the lesson was woven into her bones, that to be beautiful was to be valued, and to be valued was to be beautiful, and that the careful tending of her appearance was not vanity, but the central work and duty of her life. She was set before the mirror young, and taught to read it, and taught to fear it, and the habit, once formed, never left her, the constant private accounting of her own face, the searching for the flaw, the measuring against other faces, the quiet anxious arithmetic that would run beneath her thoughts for the rest of her days. It marked the inner life in ways that are easy to miss beneath the surface glitter. A girl raised to believe her face was her fortune learned, at the same time, that her worth was conditional and perishable, that she was loved for a thing she had not earned and could not keep, and that the love might leave when the thing did. It is a strange and lonely foundation on which to build a self, to be adored, and to suspect that the adoration is for the surface only, to be told you are precious, and to know the preciousness is wasting by the hour. Small wonder that so many beauties carried, beneath the serene loveliness the world saw, a deep and gnawing insecurity, a hunger for a reassurance that no amount of admiration could ever finally satisfy. The mirror that had been her first teacher became her lifelong companion and her secret tyrant, and the woman who lived under it was rarely as untroubled as her perfect, placid, lovely face was trained to appear. But it was a cruel power, too, for all its reach, because it was the only one, and a power that is your only one is also a trap. A woman valued for her beauty, and nothing else had everything to lose, and one single thing to lose it with. She could not fall back on a profession, a fortune of her own, a recognized mind, a public role. She had her face, and when her face went, in the world's eyes she went with it. Men of the same age grew distinguished, powerful, more respected with their years. A beauty grew only older, and the world that had crowned her simply, quietly looked away. To build a life on beauty was to build it on the one foundation guaranteed to crumble, and to know it all along, even at the dazzling height. And then there were the men, the admirers, the suitors, the worshippers, swarming around a great beauty like moths around a flame. To be beautiful was to be pursued relentlessly, showered with attention, with flattery, with proposals, with poems and flowers, and the heated glances of men who had decided, on the strength of your face alone, that they were in love. It sounds like a dream, and a girl might be forgiven for thinking it one. But there was a darker side to all that desire, for it came whether you wanted it or not, and from men you would never have chosen, and it could turn, in an instant, from worship to entitlement. A beauty was a target as much as a treasure, for the fortune hunter who wanted her face to ornament his house, for the rake who saw a conquest, for the powerful man who simply expected that beauty existed for his enjoyment. And her reputation, that fragile and priceless thing, was forever in danger precisely because she drew so many eyes. One whisper, one misstep, one bold man's lie, and the very admiration that crowned her could destroy her. Beauty, she learned, did not make her safe. It made her watched. What was it like, you might wonder, inside all of this, to be the woman behind the celebrated face? It was, for many, a strange and hollow thing. For the great beauty was adored as a vision, and known as a person by almost no one. Men composed sonnets to her eyes, who had never asked what she thought, or feared, or wanted. She was praised endlessly for the one thing she had not earned and could not keep, and rarely for her wit, her mind, her kindness, her courage, the things that were actually hers. She might be clever, and find her cleverness inconvenient to display. She might long to be loved for something that would not fade, and find that no one was interested in anything but the surface. To be a beauty was, very often, to be profoundly unseen, hidden in plain sight behind your own lovely face, a prisoner of the very gift that drew all the world's eyes, and none of its real attention. So that is a day in the life of a Victorian beauty, laced and painted and poisoned and adored, performing perfection from waking to sleep, valued for a face that is already, quietly, beginning to fade. And the truth is, you wouldn't last one, not the arsenic in the lead, not the belladonna stinging your eyes, not the breathless corset, not the endless looking, not the slow cold terror of the glass. We gaze at those lovely women in their gilded portraits, and we envy them their beauty. We forget what it cost them to keep it, and what it did to them to be nothing else. And perhaps, lying here in the soft dark, you feel a small and distant kinship with them. For though the lead paint and the belladonna and the killing corset are gone, the deeper bargain has never entirely left us. There is still, in our world, a quiet pressure on a woman to be looked at and found lovely, still a market in faces, still the long patient labor of seeming effortless, still the mirror searched each morning for the first faint sign of the years. The Victorian beauty poisoned herself with arsenic to be pale. We have only traded the particular poisons for newer ones, and the particular standards for newer standards, while the old machinery of looking and being looked at grinds quietly on. Which is exactly why her story is worth carrying gently to sleep, not to shudder at how strange the past was, but to feel, with a little tenderness, how near it still is, and to be kind, as you drift off, to every woman who ever stood before a glass and wondered whether she was enough. She was. They were. The mirror was always the liar in the room. So pity the Victorian beauty a little, before we leave her dressing table behind. She was envied by everyone and free in nothing, adored by thousands and known by almost none, handed at birth a treasure that began that very day to melt in her hands. The world told her she was the luckiest of women, and in the gilded cage of her loveliness she very often was not. And the three women waiting to carry you down into sleep tonight each took that same impossible gift and did something unforgettable with it. One was destroyed by it, one was freed by it, and one very nearly conquered the world with it, and all three, in the end, came to the same quiet truth at the bottom of the jeweled box, that a face is a fragile, fading, lonely thing to build an entire life upon. Now let the candlelight blur, and let's leave your dressing table behind. Because some women took that same dangerous gift, a face the whole world wanted, and did extraordinary things with it, seduced emperors, toppled kings, scandalized continents, and chased it all the way to the ends of the earth. Three real women, each blessed and cursed with a beauty that became the whole story of her life, to carry you gently down towards sleep. You need not hold tight to the names or the dates. Let them wash over you like the warmth of a fire. Just let the three lives unfold in the dark like a long, slow story told to a drowsy child. The first is a tale of a woman who loved her own beautiful face too well, who became, by common consent, the loveliest woman in all of Europe, the mistress of an emperor, and who poured the whole of herself into capturing that loveliness before time could steal it, until in the end she could not bear to be seen at all, and shut herself away among covered mirrors in a darkened room. The second is a tale of a woman who took her beauty and ran with it, clean off the edge of the respectable world, an English lady who loved princes and kings, and a desert sheikh, who scandalized 2 continents and found, at the very end of a wild road, a happiness almost no one of her birth ever knew. And the third is a tale of a woman who all but invented herself out of thin air and a lovely face, a dancer who was not what she claimed, who charmed a king and ruled his kingdom and helped to topple his throne, and then began again and again until the footlights finally dimmed. 3 faces, 3 fates, 1 fragile and fading gift. So settle a little deeper now. There is nothing you need to do but listen, and breathe, and let the candlelit paths draw you softly down. The first of our 3 is waiting at the edge of the firelight, in a grand Paris apartment where, years from the glory we will begin with, every mirror has been quietly covered over. Let us go back, then, to before the mirrors were veiled, back to when she was simply the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. Long before she became a recluse who covered every mirror in her darkened apartments, before she haunted the night streets of Paris veiled and alone, mourning a face that time had stolen, she was Virginia, the Countess of Castiglione, and she was, by the nearly unanimous verdict of her age, the most beautiful woman in Europe. Hers is perhaps the most extraordinary story ever told about beauty, of what it can win, and what it costs, and how a woman who is nothing but her face can be destroyed by the very thing that made her a legend. She was born Virginia Oldoini in 1837, in Italy, into the minor nobility, clever, willful, and from her earliest girlhood, astonishingly lovely. She grew up knowing that her beauty was something rare and powerful, and she was married young, at 17, to the Count of Castiglione, becoming a countess and entering a world that would worship her looks and ask nothing else of her. But it was not love or marriage that would make her famous. It was politics, and her own face, deployed as a weapon of state. For Virginia had a cousin, Camillo Cavour, the brilliant statesman who was then engineering the unification of Italy, and Italy's great hope was to win the support of the most powerful man on the continent, Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. Cavour needed influence over the emperor. And he had, in his beautiful young cousin, an instrument of remarkable potential. The story goes that he sent her to Paris with a frank and audacious mission, to charm the emperor, to win his ear, to use her beauty in the service of the Italian cause. "Succeed by whatever means you wish," he is said to have told her, and she understood him perfectly. She arrived in Paris in 1855, 19 years old and dazzling, and she fell upon the glittering court of the Second Empire like a comet. Her beauty caused an immediate sensation. The whole of fashionable Paris talked of nothing else. At a grand ball she appeared as the Queen of Hearts, in a costume so striking, so daring, so calculated to display her perfection, that it was remembered and described for decades. That single appearance is worth lingering on, drowsy as you are, because it shows the whole genius and the whole calculation of her. A great court ball at the Imperial Palace was the most watched stage in Europe, every famous beauty present in her finest, the competition at its most ferocious, and into that arena Virginia walked dressed as the Queen of Hearts, the gown cut and shaped to display her figure with an audacity that scandalized and electrified the room in a single stroke. She had not chosen the costume idly. Nothing she did was idle. She had calculated the entrance, the color, the daring, the way the candlelight would fall, the exact instant the room would become aware of her, with the cold precision of a general planning a battle, and it worked completely. The whole brilliant assembly stopped in its tracks by the sheer engineered perfection of her. It was the kind of moment a beauty might live for and dine out on for the rest of her days. For Virginia, it was simply a Tuesday's work, one more flawless deployment of the only weapon she had ever needed. And it is no accident that decades later, an old and faded recluse, she would have herself photographed again and again in that same Queen of Hearts gown, restaging the night of her supreme triumph for the unsleeping eye of the camera, trying to climb back, frame by frame, into the single most perfect moment of her life. And she achieved exactly what she had been sent to achieve. She captivated the emperor, and became, for a time, the mistress of Napoleon III himself. The girl from the minor Italian nobility now held the private ear of one of the most powerful rulers in the world, and she used her position, in her way, to whisper for the Italian cause. Her beauty had become a genuine force in the politics of Europe. The affair itself was brief, as the emperor's affairs tended to be, a matter of months at its height, in 1856 and into 1857, but its impact rang far beyond its length. The Empress Eugenie, herself one of the celebrated beauties of the age and no woman to be trifled with, was humiliated and furious. The court whispered and watched, and Virginia, never one for discretion, did little to hide her conquest. She was received at the imperial palaces, including the great house parties at Compiègne where the empire gathered its glittering guests, and there she reigned as the sensation of the season, the dangerous Italian beauty who had caught the emperor's eye. But she overplayed her hand, as the proud and the young so often do. Her arrogance, her open triumph, her refusal to be merely one discreet diversion among the emperor's many, all of it wore on him and outraged the court, and the affair cooled as quickly as it had flared. By the time it ended, she had made as many enemies as conquests, and the bloom of her great Paris moment was already, after barely 2 years, beginning to pass. Then came a darker shadow still. In early 1858, an Italian revolutionary named Orsini hurled bombs at the emperor's carriage in an attempt to assassinate him, a plot born, ironically, of the very Italian nationalist cause Virginia herself had been sent to serve. The attempt failed, but it threw a cloud of suspicion over every Italian close to the emperor, and Virginia, with her nationalist connections and her recent intimacy with Napoleon, found herself touched by the swirl of rumor and danger. Whether she knew anything of such plots is doubtful, but in the paranoid aftermath it scarcely mattered. The glamour curdled, the doors that had flown open began to close, and not long after she withdrew from Paris for a time, back toward Italy, her great moment on the imperial stage effectively over. She had been at the very summit of European society and politics for the space of about 3 years. The rest of her long life would be lived in the lengthening shadow of those 3 years, forever measuring the present against that impossible peak. But Virginia's deepest love was never the emperor, nor any man. Her deepest love, her true and lifelong obsession, was her own image, and it found its outlet in a brand new art that might have been invented expressly for her: photography. In an age when the camera was a strange and wondrous novelty, the Countess of Castiglione grasped its power instantly and completely. She formed a partnership with a Paris photographer that would last for decades, and together they produced hundreds upon hundreds of photographs of her, more images of herself than perhaps any other person of the entire 19th century. She directed every one. She chose the poses, the costumes, the lighting, the angles. She stared down the lens with a controlled, theatrical intensity. She reenacted the great moments of her life, posed as queens and characters and allegories, exposed a bare foot or a shoulder in images startlingly bold for their day. She was, in a sense, the world had never quite seen before, the author and the subject and the director of her own endless portrait, the first great artist of the self-image, obsessively curating how she would be seen and remembered, a full century and more before the world filled with people doing exactly the same. The partnership at the heart of this was with a photographer named Pierre-Louis Pierson of a fashionable Paris studio, and it endured, on and off, for some 40 years, an extraordinary collaboration between a woman and a camera that produced, by the time it was done, something on the order of 700 separate images of her. Think of what that meant in an age when most people sat for a photograph once or twice in their entire lives, stiff and formal, and counted it a great occasion. Virginia returned again and again and again, year upon year, decade upon decade, treating the studio as her stage and Pierson as her instrument, paying handsomely for every plate. She would arrive with costumes and properties and elaborate ideas, and she would pose for hours, and she would scrutinize the results with a ferocious, exacting eye, ordering this one tinted, that one reworked, this expression caught again more perfectly. No painter, no patron, no monarch of that century left behind so vast and so deliberate a record of a single human face. She was building, without quite knowing the word for it, an archive of herself, a museum of her own beauty, curated by its soul-obsessed devotee. And here is the detail that lifts her whole strange project from vanity into something almost like art. She did not only photograph herself young and lovely. As the decades passed and her beauty faded, she went back and photographed that too, the older face, the ruined glory, the long aftermath, restaging old triumphs with an aging body, holding the empty frame up to a face that was no longer what it had been. She made of her own decline a subject, unflinchingly, in private, even as she hid that decline from the living world behind her veils and her covered mirrors. It is as though she could only bear to look at what time had done to her through the mediating eye of the camera, at one remove, made into an image she controlled. The mirror she could not face. The photograph, somehow, she could. There is a whole human soul in that contradiction, and a whole century's terrible lesson about beauty written across those hundreds of fading plates. There are stories about her vanity that have become legend, and they are worth telling because they show how completely her beauty had become her entire self. At that famous ball where she came as the Queen of Hearts, in a gown daringly cut to display her perfect figure, a woman is said to have remarked, archly, that the heart was placed rather low, to which Virginia coolly replied that it was placed exactly over the spot where it ruled. She knew precisely what she was, and she wielded it without apology. She would keep a room full of the most important people in Europe waiting for hours while she perfected her appearance, and arrived certain that her entrance would justify every minute. She regarded her own beauty not as a gift to be grateful for but as a kind of sovereign fact, a throne she sat upon by right. Other women found her impossible, arrogant, cold. She did not care. She had decided that she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and for a time the world agreed with her, and that agreement was the air she breathed. In the photographs, this obsession reached a pitch that still astonishes. Over the decades she returned again and again to the studio, restaging her life and her fantasies before the lens, herself in the famous ball gowns, herself as a nun, as a queen, as a figure of vengeance, herself displaying a bare ankle or foot in images so bold they could not be openly shown. She had her own legs photographed in isolation. She posed peering through an empty picture frame held up to her eye, as though framing her own image for eternity. She paid for it all, and directed it all, pouring her fortune and her later years into this single endless project of capturing herself. There was even a darker shadow over her time of glory. She was rumored to have been caught up at the edges of a plot against the emperor's life, the kind of intrigue that swirled around anyone so close to power, and for a time she had to leave Paris under a cloud. Power and beauty and danger were braided together all through her story, exactly as they were for every woman who got too near a throne. For all that she lived for her own image, Virginia was a wife and a mother too, though these roles sat lightly upon a woman so consumed by herself. She had a son, whom she largely left to others to raise, as women of her world so often did, her attention fixed elsewhere, on the emperor, on the court, on the mirror, on the camera. Her marriage had crumbled early under the weight of her ambitions and her affairs. Her husband, humiliated, had drifted away. The people who might have loved the woman rather than the image found there was little room left for them beside her great love of herself. And perhaps that was the deepest poverty of her gilded life, that she had made her own beauty into an idol so demanding that no ordinary human affection could compete with it, and so she ended, for all her worshippers, with almost no one who truly loved her at all. The long middle of her life, the decades between the dazzling Paris triumph of her 20s and the veiled recluse of her final years, was a slow, sad drifting, and it is the part of her story the legend usually skips. She moved between Italy and France, never quite recovering the heights of that first incandescent moment, her fortune dwindling under the weight of her extravagance and her endless photographic obsession, her temper and her pride driving away those who might have stayed. She quarreled and withdrew and reappeared and withdrew again. And she suffered the deepest wound a mother can suffer. Her only son, the child she had largely left to others while she pursued her glory, died young, before her, a loss that fell on her heavily, whatever the distance between them had been, and darkened still further a spirit already turning inward. Bit by bit the brilliant, imperious young woman who had kept emperors waiting hardened into an eccentric, solitary, difficult figure, guarding the relics of a vanished greatness, haunted by a past that grew only more golden as the present grew more gray. The world had given her one perfect season and then taken back everything else, and she had no second thing, no settled love, no work, no faith, no quiet contentment, to fill the enormous space where the adoration had been. It is tempting to mock her vanity, and easy, but it is worth pausing to feel the strangeness and the sadness of it. For Virginia had been told, from her earliest girlhood, that her beauty was the most important thing about her, the source of her value, her power, her place in the world. She had simply believed it more completely than anyone, and built her whole self upon it, and pursued its preservation with a devotion that became a kind of art and a kind of madness. In a sense, she was only doing, to the furthest extreme, what her entire century told every beautiful woman to do, to treat her face as her fortune, and to guard it above all things. She just took the lesson to its logical and terrible end. And in those hundreds of obsessive photographs, she created something genuinely new and genuinely haunting, the first great record of a woman authoring her own image across a lifetime, fighting the camera and time to a draw, leaving behind a face that would never now grow old. It was vanity, yes, colossal, monumental vanity. But it was something stranger and sadder, too. For Virginia understood, with a clarity that became a kind of madness, that her beauty was the whole of her, and that it was passing, and she was trying, frame by frame, to fix it forever, to defeat time with the camera, to make permanent the one thing that could not last. She was racing the clock, and the clock, as it always does, won. Because her life, for all its dazzling beginning, became a long unraveling. The affair with the emperor ended. Her marriage had already collapsed. Her great political moment passed, and the world, having adored her, began to look elsewhere, as it always does. And Virginia could not bear it. She had built her entire identity on being the most beautiful woman alive, and as the years took that title from her, they took everything. She grew obsessive, difficult, increasingly isolated. And as her famous beauty faded, she did a thing of almost unbearable poignancy. She withdrew from the world entirely, shut herself away in a Paris apartment, and had the mirrors covered or removed, so that she would never have to see what time had done to the face that had once stopped emperors. She had the rooms hung in funereal colors. She went out, when she went out at all, by night, heavily veiled, a ghost of the legend she had been, unwilling to let the world see her as anything less than the goddess of her youth. The years of her decline are almost unbearably poignant to picture. The woman who had been the most looked-at creature in Europe could no longer bear to be looked at, nor to look at herself. She shut out the daylight, and lived among heavy dark hangings. She kept the relics of her glory around her, the gowns, the portraits of her young face, while refusing to let any mirror show her the old one. She fell into debt and eccentricity, and a deepening solitude, her great beauty gone, her great love gone, her political moment a fading memory, clinging to the photographs as the only proof that she had ever been the goddess the world once worshipped. She would walk out only at night, swathed in veils, a phantom drifting through the same Paris that had once stopped to stare at her in the full light of day. She died in 1899, alone, more or less forgotten by the society that had once worshipped her, a strange and tragic recluse. But she left behind those hundreds of photographs, that vast, obsessive, brilliant record of a single face across a lifetime, and in them she achieved, after all, a kind of immortality. The beauty she could not keep in life, she captured on the glass plates, and there she remains, forever staring down the lens, forever in command of her own image, the most photographed woman of her century. And there is a strange afterlife to her story that she could never have foreseen. In the years after her lonely death, a French aristocrat and aesthete, a poet and collector with a connoisseur's eye for the beautiful and the doomed, became fascinated by the legend of the vanished countess, sought out and gathered her scattered photographs, and wrote a whole book devoted to her, rescuing her from the near oblivion into which she had sunk. Through such devotion her astonishing images survived, and passed in time into the great museums of the world, where they hang today as treasures, studied now not as the vanity of a foolish woman, but as something genuinely unprecedented in the history of the image, the first sustained, deliberate, decades-long project by a person to author and control her own likeness. Scholars and curators look at those hundreds of plates and see, with a slight shiver of recognition, the distant ancestor of everything our own age does with its endless self-made images, the woman who, alone in a Paris studio a century and a half ago, was already doing what the whole world would one day do with a small glass screen, curating a self for the eye of posterity. She wanted to be looked at forever. She has, in the end, exactly got her wish. So as you grow drowsy, hold her story gently. Virginia of Castiglione had beauty beyond almost any woman who ever lived, and beauty gave her everything, an emperor, a place in history, a fame that still echoes. And then it left her, as it leaves everyone, and because she had been given nothing else to be, and had let her whole self become her face, its passing destroyed her. She is the purest, saddest parable of the beauty's curse, that to be loved for your face alone is to be handed a treasure that is already, from the first day, beginning to melt in your hands, and to spend your life covering the mirrors rather than ever once being known for anything else. Long before she became the beloved wife of a Bedouin sheikh, riding through the Syrian desert beneath a vast and starry sky, she was Jane Digby, an English aristocrat of dazzling beauty, and even more dazzling scandal, who took the face and the fortune she was born with, and used them not to win a comfortable place in society, but to burn straight through it, across a whole continent, in pursuit of love and adventure and her own untamable heart. If Castiglione is the tragedy of beauty, Jane Digby is its wild, joyful, scandalous romance. She was born in 1807 into the heart of the English aristocracy, granddaughter of an earl, raised in wealth and privilege on a great country estate, and she grew into one of the great beauties of her generation, golden-haired, violet-eyed, with a warmth and a vitality that men found utterly irresistible. She was educated, accomplished, a gifted artist and linguist with a quick mind and a wild, romantic spirit that the narrow life of an aristocratic young lady could never hope to contain. She was the kind of girl her century found dangerous, too much alive, too full of longing, too unwilling to fold herself into the small shape her world had cut for her. She was married off young, at 17, in the usual way, to a much older man, Lord Ellenborough, a cold and ambitious politician. And in the usual way, the marriage was a loveless disappointment. But Jane was not the usual woman, and she did not endure it in dignified silence as her century demanded. She fell in love, passionately, recklessly, with another man, and then another, and she conducted her affairs with a boldness that scandalized all of England. Her first marriage ended in a divorce so sensational it required an Act of Parliament, the lurid details splashed across every newspaper in the land. At an age when most women's lives were just settling into their narrow grooves, Jane Digby had already made herself one of the most notorious women in Europe, and she was only getting started. The divorce cost her dearly in ways the romance of her story can obscure. Under the brutal law of the age, the scandal and the separations meant children lost to her, left behind in the wreckage of broken marriages, the price a woman paid for following her heart in a world that permitted her no such freedom. Jane bore several children across her many unions, and the currents of her restless life carried her away from more than one of them. A grief threaded quietly through all the glamour. She had chosen passion over the safe and sanctioned path, and the choice had real costs, and she paid them, and she did not turn back. That, too, is part of her truth, that her freedom was real, and so was its price, and she judged the freedom worth it to the end. What followed was a life of romance on a scale that reads like a novel too extravagant to be believed. Cast out of respectable English society, Jane simply left it, and went to the continent, and there she lived and loved exactly as she pleased, decade after decade, her beauty opening every door. She became the lover, and in time the wife, of a series of remarkable men across Europe. It began with a grand passion for a dashing Austrian prince, a diplomat whose charm matched her own, for whom she left her husband and her old life entirely. A scandal that fed the newspapers for months and sealed her exile from respectable England forever. That love, like so many, burned bright and then cooled, and Jane, undaunted, moved on, and on again, each new chapter unfolding in a new country, in a new language, with a new remarkable man. She had a passionate affair with that Austrian prince. She married a German baron. She captivated a king. She became the mistress of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, the same besotted, beauty-loving monarch who would later lose his throne over another woman in this very story. She married a Greek count and lived for years in Greece, where she took as a lover a wild Albanian brigand general, and lived with him in the mountains, riding and hunting, far from any drawing-room. Husbands, princes, kings, outlaws, Jane loved them all, fully and fearlessly, following her heart wherever it led with a freedom almost no woman of her age could even imagine, let alone seize. Society was scandalized. Jane was happy. She had simply decided that her one life belonged to her, and she lived it. It is worth naming the chapters of that astonishing life, for each reads like a novel in itself. The grand passion that broke her first marriage was for an Austrian diplomat, Prince Felix Schwarzenberg, a dazzling and ambitious man who would one day rise to lead an empire's government, by whom she had a daughter, and who then, having ruined her in the eyes of England, declined to marry her and let her go. From that wreckage she made her way to Munich, and there she caught the eye of King Ludwig I of Bavaria, that same beauty-besotted monarch whose weakness for lovely faces ran like a thread through the age, and who would later destroy his own throne over Lola Montez. With Jane, he formed an attachment that was part romance and part lifelong friendship, and he remained fond of her for decades. In Bavaria she married a German nobleman, Baron Karl von Venningen, and bore him children, and might have settled at last into respectable comfort, but the restless heart would not be still, and she fell in love again, this time with a Greek count, and left the patient baron, who is said to have behaved throughout with a wounded dignity that only made the leaving sadder. There is a story from that parting that catches the whole drama of her life in a single scene. When the baron, her husband, the father of her children, discovered the affair with the young Greek count, he did what a man of honor of that age was expected to do. He challenged the interloper to a duel, and the two men met with pistols over the body, in effect of Jane Digby. The Baron wounded his rival, but not fatally, and then, having satisfied honor, he did a thing of remarkable and painful grace. Seeing that Jane's heart was truly gone, he did not rage or imprison or destroy her, as the law and custom would have let him do. He let her go. He arranged the parting with dignity, kept a fond and protective regard for her for the rest of his life, and remained, astonishingly, something like a friend. Few men so wrong behaved so well, and that he did says as much about the strange magnetic warmth Jane carried with her as any of her conquests. For even the husbands she left seemed mostly to have gone on loving her, unable quite to hate the woman who had upended their lives. She inspired devotion the way other women inspire mere desire, and she left it in her wake everywhere she went, a trail not of bitterness, but of men who never entirely got over her. So to Greece she went, and married her Count, Spiridon Theotokes, and there suffered one of the deepest griefs of her life. A young son, by some accounts, lost in a terrible accident, a fall, the kind of blow that marks a person forever. The marriage to the Count failed as the others had, and Jane, now in her 40s, an age her century thought far past romance, entered the orbit of the Greek court and took up with a wild Albanian general, a former mountain brigand named Haji Petros, and lived with him and his irregular troops in the highlands, riding and camping and sharing a rough soldier's life that would have horrified every drawing-room in England. Husbands, a prince, a king, a count, a brigand general, and she was not yet finished. The greatest love still lay ahead, in the desert she had not yet seen. Each of these men she had loved entirely, in his turn. Each chapter she had entered without a backward glance, and through all of it she had paid, again and again, the price the law and the age exacted from a woman who loved as freely as a man, lost children, lost fortune, lost name, and had judged it, every time, a price worth paying for the freedom to live as her own heart commanded. And here is what the scandal sheets of her own day could never see past her notoriety to notice: that Jane Digby was a woman of real and considerable gifts, and not merely a beautiful troublemaker tumbling from one man's arms to the next. She had a true talent for languages, and across her wandering life she gathered them as others gather souvenirs, coming in the end to speak many tongues, French and German and Italian and Greek and, in her last great chapter, Arabic, with genuine fluency, so that she could make a home and a conversation almost anywhere on earth. She drew and painted with a real eye. She read widely, and thought for herself, and kept up a lively curiosity about the world to the very end of her long life, corresponding with scholars and explorers, prized as a guide and an interlocutor by the learned travelers who sought her out in Damascus. She rode superbly, managed her own affairs with shrewdness, and showed across 8 decades a courage, physical and moral both, that few of her sheltered countrywomen were ever asked to find in themselves. She was, in short, a great deal more than the sum of her marriages, a whole vivid human being of warmth and intelligence and nerve. But her century had decided what a woman who loved as she loved must be, and filed her under scandal, and looked no further. It is only from a distance of many years that we can see her plainly, not a fallen woman at all, but a free one, who paid for her freedom, and never once asked for the price back. But her greatest love, and her last, was still ahead of her, and it lay in a place no English aristocrat was ever expected to go. In her 40s, an age at which the century considered a woman's romantic life thoroughly over, Jane traveled to the Middle East, to the deserts of Syria, drawn by a thirst for adventure that had never once been quenched. And there, on a journey across the desert, she met Medjil el-Mezrab, a sheikh of a Bedouin tribe, a nobleman of the desert, educated, dignified, some 20 years younger than she. And the great beauty who had loved princes and kings fell, at last, into the deepest and truest love of her life with a Bedouin sheikh, and married him, and stayed. Their courtship itself reads like a romance. The desert journey, the danger, the proud sheikh, and the famous Englishwoman falling, against every expectation of either of their worlds, into a love that neither could deny. There were obstacles enough. The gulf of culture, of religion, of language, the disapproval that followed her even here. But Jane, who had never once let the world's disapproval stop her, swept it all aside as she always had. She married him, and she committed to the marriage with the same wholehearted passion she had given everything in her life, and this time, at last, the passion held. It was not, in the beginning, an easy or an obvious match, and that it endured is the wonder of it. She was a famous, much-married European aristocrat in her middle years. He was a Bedouin sheikh of a proud desert people, with a world, a faith, and a tongue entirely unlike her own. There were those on both sides who thought it folly. There were long separations in the early years, and at least one painful test when Jane, uncertain, very nearly turned back toward Europe, and found that she could not, that her heart was bound now to the desert and the man, and returned to him for good. She learned his language, and his people's ways, and made herself genuinely one of them rather than a curious European playing at it. She arranged their life with her own money and her own will, as she had always arranged her life. A fine house in Damascus for part of the year, where she kept her books and her garden and received the travelers who came, half in disbelief, to meet the legend, and for the rest of the year the black goat-hair tints of the open desert, where she lived the migrant life of the tribe in full. And she did not live it as a pampered guest. By the accounts of those who knew her, she rose before dawn to tend the animals, milked the camels with her own hands, dressed as the Bedouin women dressed, rode the finest horses across the sand, and shared without complaint in the hardships and the dangers, the raids, the feuds, the long hot marches of a hard nomadic life. She bore the heat and the rough fare and the perils, and won by it the real respect of a people not easily impressed by a foreigner. The granddaughter of an English earl, who had been painted by fashionable artists and courted by kings, ended her days happily milking camels under the desert stars. The wife of a man she had chosen freely and loved without reserve, in a life she had reached only by defying every expectation her birth had laid upon her. When she died, full of years, her Bedouin husband and her adopted people mourned her as their own, and she was buried far from the green fields of Dorset where she had been born, which was, by every sign she ever gave, exactly where she wished to lie. It took the world a long time to understand her, and in her own century it never really did. To the England that had cast her out she remained simply a scandal, a byword for a woman who had thrown away everything respectable for the sake of her passions, a cautionary tale told to wayward daughters, a name spoken with a raised eyebrow. It is only with the distance of years, and the patient work of those who later pieced her astonishing life together from her letters and diaries, that a truer picture has emerged, not of a woman ruined by her appetites, but of a woman who refused, again and again and at enormous cost, to live a lie, who would not stay in a loveless marriage for the sake of appearances, would not pretend a contentment she did not feel, would not shrink herself to fit the narrow shape her birth and her century. had cut for her. She wanted to live fully, to love truly, to see the world and ride its open spaces, and follow her own heart wherever it led, and she did all of it, in an age that told women they might do none of it. The price was high, and she paid it without flinching. And she ended her long, scandalous, extraordinary life not broken and not penitent, but profoundly content, an old woman happy under the desert stars beside the man she loved. Of all the fates that befell the beauties in this story, hers may be the one most worth the wanting. She spent the rest of her days, nearly 3 decades, living as the wife of Sheikh Medjool, dividing her life between a house in Damascus and the black tents of the desert. She rose before dawn to milk the camels. She dressed in the manner of the Bedouin women. She rode magnificent horses across the open desert. She shared in the dangers and the migrations and the fierce tribal life of her husband's people, and won their genuine respect. She kept up her reading and her languages and her wide curiosity, corresponding with travelers and scholars, a woman of deep cultivation living a life of astonishing wildness. Famous Western travelers who passed through Damascus sought her out, half disbelieving that this dignified, weathered, happy woman in Eastern dress was the same Jane Digby whose scandals had once shaken all of Europe. She had become something no one could have predicted, not a ruined woman, not a cautionary tale, but a person wholly at home in a life she had chosen with her own free heart. She learned Arabic, and several other languages besides. She adopted the dress and the ways of her husband's people. She rode with the tribe, lived through their migrations and their feuds, and became a respected figure in a world utterly unlike the gilded English drawing rooms of her birth. And by every account, she was, finally, deeply and lastingly happy. The restless heart that had carried her across a continent and through the arms of kings had found, in the vast quiet of the desert and the love of one good man, the peace it had always been chasing. She died in Damascus in 1881, in her 70s, mourned by her husband and the people who had become her own, an English lady laid to rest a world away from the land of her birth. So let her story warm you as you drift. Jane Digby was given the same dangerous gift as every beauty in this story, a face that the world desired, a face that could have bought her a safe and gilded and utterly conventional life. And she spent it, gloriously, on freedom instead. Where Castiglione let her beauty become her prison, Jane Digby made hers a passport, and used it to escape the cage entirely, to live, fully and scandalously and joyfully, on her own terms, in a century that gave women almost no terms at all. The world called her a fallen woman. She rode off into the desert and lived happily ever after. Of the two, history may have called the wrong one ruined. Long before she was a faded star dying poor and forgotten in New York, before she ruled a kingdom from a king's bedchamber and brought a government crashing down around her, she was Eliza, an Irish girl named Eliza Gilbert, who reinvented herself so completely, so audaciously, that she conquered Europe under a name and a face that were almost entirely her own invention. Lola Montez is the story of beauty as pure, brazen performance, a woman who had no rank, no fortune, and not even, really, the talent she claimed, only nerve, and looks, and an absolute refusal to be ordinary, and who used them to climb higher than almost any adventuress of her age, and to fall just as spectacularly. The bare facts of her beginnings are worth pausing on, because they make what followed seem the more impossible. She was born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert, in Ireland, the daughter of a young army officer of modest means. When she was still a small child her father was posted to India, and there he died of cholera, leaving the little girl and her young widowed mother far from home. She was sent back to be raised among relations in Scotland and England, a high-spirited, dark-eyed, difficult girl who chafed against every attempt to school her into a proper young lady. When her family arranged, as families did, to marry her off to a much older man, she rebelled in the most decisive way she could. She eloped, at 16, with a young lieutenant, and ran off to India as his wife. That marriage, born of a girl's bid for freedom, soured quickly into misery and separation, and by her early 20s Eliza Gilbert was exactly what her century had no mercy for, a beautiful young woman, married but parted from her husband, with no money, no protector, and a reputation already in tatters. There was no respectable road left open to her at all. And so she did the one audacious thing left. She decided to stop being Eliza Gilbert. Her launch into the new identity was almost comically disastrous, and tells you everything about the nerve that would carry her. She debuted in London as Lola Montez, the Spanish dancer, swathed in mantillas and mystery, and was almost immediately recognized by people who had known her as plain Mrs. James, and denounced in the press as a fraud. A lesser adventuress would have crumbled. Lola simply gathered her skirts and left for the continent, where she was not yet known, and there relaunched the very same fiction with such conviction that it took. She danced her way across the capitals of Europe, taking famous lovers as she went, among them, by repute, the great composer Franz Liszt himself, who is said to have found her as exhausting as she was bewitching, and trailing scandal and broken contracts and outraged theater managers in her wake. She was thrown out of cities. She fought with the press. And everywhere she went, the crowds came, precisely because of the noise, exactly as she intended. Her conquests in those years read like a roll call of the famous men of the age. She is linked, by repute and by her own telling, with the great pianist and idol of Europe, Franz Liszt, who was said to find her beauty intoxicating and her temper impossible in roughly equal measure. There is a tale, perhaps embroidered, that he once locked her in a hotel room and slipped away, paying in advance for the furniture he was sure she would smash when she woke and found him gone. She moved through the brilliant literary and artistic salons of Paris, where the celebrated novelist Alexandre Dumas and his circle knew her, and where she took as a lover a handsome journalist whose death in a duel, fought, in part, over her, touched even her hard-won composure, and was said to be one of the few losses that ever truly grieved her. Wherever the famous and the gifted gathered, Lola appeared among them, not as a hanger-on but as a force, matching the great men of the day in nerve and outrunning them in sheer audacity. She was not educated, not refined, not even, by honest reckoning, especially talented, and yet she stood at the very center of the most glittering company in Europe, on nothing but the strength of her face, her fury, and her absolute refusal to know her place. It was a kind of genius, even if it was a genius for spectacle rather than for any art, and it carried her, in a few short years, from a ruined Irish girl to the lover of a king. She was born around 1821 in Ireland, the daughter of an army officer, and her early life was unremarkable and unhappy in the usual ways. A girlhood partly in India, a hasty youthful marriage to escape an arranged one, an elopement, a separation. By her early 20s, she was a beautiful young woman with a ruined reputation, no money, and no respectable future. Most women in that position sank quietly. Eliza did the opposite. She invented a new person entirely. She reappeared in the capitals of Europe as Lola Montez, a glamorous and exotic Spanish dancer of noble birth, none of which was true. She was Irish, not Spanish. Her noble blood was a fiction, and her dancing, by most honest accounts, was mediocre at best, a daring and improvised affair that relied far more on her stunning looks and her shameless audacity than on any real skill. It did not matter in the least. She had beauty, and she had a magnificent, unshakable confidence, and she swept across Europe on the strength of them, dancing, scandalizing, taking famous lovers, fighting with managers and audiences, leaving a trail of gossip and outrage wherever she went. Her most notorious performance was the so-called spider dance, in which she pretended to discover spiders caught in her skirts and shook and stamped and writhed to be rid of them, lifting her petticoats in a manner that audiences found either scandalous or thrilling and critics found absurd. But they came, and they talked, and that was the entire point. She understood, with a modern showman's instinct, that being talked about was worth more than being good. And she had a temper that became as famous as her face. Lola brooked no insult and feared no man. She was known to carry a horsewhip and a dagger, and to use the whip on men who crossed her, journalists, policemen, anyone who dared. She fought duels of words, and sometimes very nearly of blades. She was, in an age that demanded women be soft, submissive, and silent, a woman who was loud, fierce, armed, and utterly unafraid, and that, as much as her beauty, was what made her a sensation and a scandal wherever she appeared. People had simply never seen anything like her. And then she arrived in Bavaria and made history. For there she captivated King Ludwig I, that same beauty-besotted monarch, an aging man with a passion for lovely women and the arts, and Ludwig fell for Lola utterly, completely, ruinously. He made her his mistress. He showered her with money and a grand house. He created her Countess of Lanfeld, raising the Irish adventuress to the nobility by royal decree. And then he did the truly unthinkable thing. He let her influence how he governed. Lola Montez, the false Spanish dancer, became for a time the real power behind the Bavarian throne, advising the king, shaping his policies, making and breaking his ministers, a foreign woman of dubious origins effectively ruling a European kingdom from the king's affections. For a year and more she reigned as the uncrowned queen of Bavaria, and the king's devotion to her knew no limit. He wrote her poetry, lavished a fortune upon her, built her a palace, and bent the policy of his kingdom to her will and her whims. She used her influence to push the king toward more liberal measures and against the conservative powers of the land, particularly the church and its allies, making herself the bitter enemy of the most powerful factions in Bavaria. A foreign adventuress, a woman, a dancer of false pedigree, dictating the affairs of state through the bedchamber of an infatuated old king, to the Bavarian establishment, it was an outrage almost beyond bearing, and their fury at her became a fury at the king himself. The Bavarian establishment was appalled. The public turned against her. And in the great wave of revolutions that swept Europe in 1848, the fury at Lola became part of the fury that brought Ludwig down. There were riots, the king was forced to abdicate his throne, and Lola fled the country. Her beauty had raised her to rule a kingdom, and helped, in the end, to topple a king. Picture, as you sink deeper into the pillows, the sheer improbability of what she became in Bavaria, because there has rarely been anything like it. Here was a kingdom of the old order, pious, conservative, governed by an aging king and his ministers, and watched closely by the church, and into its heart walked an Irish woman in her 20s, with a false name and a false nation and a dancer's reputation, and within months she was the single most powerful private person in the realm. Ministers who displeased her were dismissed. Policies she favored were advanced. Men sought her favor because her favor was the road to the kings. She was made a countess of the land by royal decree, given a fine house and an income and a place at the very summit, all on the strength of an old man's helpless devotion to her face and her fire. University students brawled in the streets over her. The newspapers raged. The powerful men of the kingdom seethed at the spectacle of a foreign adventuress steering the affairs of state from a king's bedchamber. For a year and more she held it, this dizzying, impossible eminence, and she seemed to have enjoyed every reckless moment of it, ruling and quarreling and provoking with the same shameless verve she brought to everything, as though daring the whole established world to stop her. The whole established world, in the end, did exactly that. But for that one wild year, an Irish girl with nothing but nerve and a lovely face had a European crown bending to her will, and that has to be one of the most astonishing things a beauty ever did with a dangerous gift this evening has been about. What is almost beyond belief is how little the catastrophe slowed her. Cast out of Bavaria, her royal protector dethroned, she made her way to England, and there, with breathtaking nerve, married a wealthy young army officer named George Heald, a man years her junior, with a handsome fortune of his own. The trouble was that her first husband, the lieutenant of her runaway girlhood, was still living, and their union never properly dissolved, so that this glittering new marriage was, in the eyes of the law, bigamy. A scandal and a prosecution loomed. The couple fled abroad to escape it, and that marriage too, like everything Lola touched, soon collapsed in quarrels and flight. By now she had been the mistress of a king, a countess of the realm, the power behind a throne, and a fugitive bigamist, all before the age of 30. Most people do not pack so much into a lifetime as Lola Montez packed into a decade, and the most extraordinary acts of her career were still to come, across an ocean she had not yet crossed. So she turned, as the restless and the ruined so often did in that century, to America, the great stage where a famous name and a beautiful face could always draw a crowd, and where her European scandals were not a disgrace, but an advertisement. She arrived to enormous curiosity and toured the country as a celebrity performer, dancing her notorious dances and, in a stroke of pure modern showmanship, starring in a stage play about her own life, appearing nightly as herself, reenacting the rise and fall in Bavaria, selling her own legend back to the public, who could not get enough of it. Then she pushed on to the very edge of the world, to the gold-rush boomtowns of California, where she settled for a time in a rough little mining town and lived among the diggers and the saloons, a former almost queen keeping a cottage full of pets, including, by the fondest of the legends, a tame grizzly bear cub, magnificent and impossible at the raw frontier's edge. From there she sailed even further, to Australia, to perform her spider dance for crowds of miners at the literal other end of the earth. Wherever the world was wildest and least respectable, Lola was welcome, and Lola went. What followed was the long descent that so often follows such a blazing rise. Lola, ever resourceful, kept moving and kept reinventing. She turned up in America, and toured the country as a celebrity and a stage performer, trading on her notoriety, even acting out her own scandalous life on stage in a kind of one-woman show. She traveled to the gold-rush boomtowns of California, and as far as Australia, performing her famous and faintly outrageous dances for rough frontier crowds of miners, who had not seen a celebrated European beauty in years, and received her like visiting royalty. For a time she settled in a little California mining town, in a cottage where she kept a menagerie of pets, including, by some accounts, a tame grizzly bear, a former countess and almost queen of Bavaria living among the gold diggers at the raw edge of the world, still magnificent, still impossible, still entirely herself. She reinvented her act yet again, touring America with dramatic lectures on beauty, on fashion, on the famous lovers and adventures of her own life, narrating her legend directly to paying audiences who could not get enough of it. She wrote, or had ghost-written, a book on the arts of beauty, dispensing to ordinary women the secrets of the face that had toppled a throne. But the fame that runs on beauty and scandal burns fast, and Lola's was burning out. Her looks, the engine of everything, began to fade. Her money ran low. Her health failed. In her final years she ended up back in New York, poorer and quieter, and, in one last unexpected turn, increasingly religious, devoting her last energies to charitable work among fallen women, the very category the world had always placed her in. There is something deeply human in that final chapter. The woman who had been the scandal of 2 continents, who had built her whole legend on audacity and spectacle and the worship of her own face, ending in quiet piety, visiting the poor and the outcast, seeking some peace beyond the footlights. A stroke left her weakened. Her famous beauty and her famous energy alike drained away, and she died young, around 40, in reduced and humble circumstances, a world away from the palace Ludwig had built her. The grizzly bear, the horsewhip, the toppled throne, the spider dance, the countess's coronet, all of it behind her now, and only a quiet woman of failing health left at the end, making what peace she could. She died there in 1861, only around 40 years old, far from the palaces and the kings, buried under a simpler version of one of her many invented names. Pause, as you drift, on the strangeness of those last American years, because they hold the whole riddle of her. She had reinvented herself so many times: Irish girl, runaway bride, Spanish dancer, royal mistress, countess, fugitive, frontier eccentric, and now she reinvented herself once more, this time as a teacher and a sage of the very art that had been her whole life, beauty itself. She stood on lecture platforms across America and held audiences spellbound, talking about fashion, about gallantry, about the famous beauties of history, about her own scandalous adventures dressed up as wisdom, an early, dazzling example of a person who was famous, fundamentally, for being famous, who had turned her own notorious self into the product she sold. She lent her name to a book on the arts and secrets of beauty, passing along to ordinary women the lore of the face that had toppled a throne, how to care for the skin and the hair and the figure, the very catalogue of labors we began this evening with, set down by the most notorious beauty of the age. She understood publicity in her bones, a full century before the word meant what it means to us. She knew that attention was the true currency, that the story was the product, that a woman with a famous face and an unkillable nerve need never truly be poor while the crowd still wanted to look. And yet the footlights dimmed, as they always do. The beauty that had been the engine of all of it began to fail. The money thinned. Her health broke. And the woman who had spent her life as the loudest, boldest, most shameless spectacle of 2 continents turned, at the very end, unexpectedly quiet and inward. In her last months, weakened and humbled, she gave herself to religion and to charity, and spent what strength she had left visiting and comforting the poor and the outcast and the fallen women of the city, the very women society lumped her in with, the category she had defied and ornamented all her life. There is something almost unbearably tender in that final turn. The great performer, the toppler of kings, sitting at last by the beds of the forgotten, no audience, no costume, no spider dance, only a dying woman trying to do a little good and make a little peace before the dark. She had lived the loudest life imaginable on the strength of a beautiful face, and she went out softly, the face faded, the noise stilled, having learned perhaps the same lesson all our beauties learned, that the looking ends, and the crowd disperses, and what is left at the close is only the soul that was there beneath the famous face the whole time, waiting to be known. So as the candle burns low, consider what she was. Lola Montez was, in a sense, the most modern of all our beauties, a woman who understood that in a world dazzled by a lovely face, you did not even need the substance, only the performance, that you could invent yourself whole, name and nation and noble blood and all, and the world would believe you if you only believed it hard enough and were beautiful enough to carry it off. She had almost nothing the world claimed to value, no real rank, no fortune, no great talent, and with beauty and sheer audacity she made herself a countess and the power behind a throne. It could not last. It never can. The same fading face that ended Castiglione ended her. But for one wild decade, Eliza Gilbert of Ireland, armed with nothing but her looks and her nerve, bent kings and kingdoms to her will. There is a terrible, dazzling lesson in that about the power the world hands to a beautiful woman, and about how little, in the end, it is ever really hers to keep. Lie quietly now, and hold the three of them together in your mind a moment, for laid side by side they make a strange and lovely constellation. Three women, born within a few decades and a few hundred miles of one another, each handed at birth that same dangerous gift, a face the world could not stop looking at, and each took it down a wholly different road. Virginia of Castiglione turned hers inward, and made of her own image an idol she worshipped until it destroyed her, dying veiled among covered mirrors, the prisoner of her own perfection. Jane Digby turned hers outward and away, and used it to walk out of the gilded cage entirely, spending her beauty on freedom and adventure and love until she found peace at last under the desert stars. And Lola Montez turned hers into pure performance, inventing a whole self out of nerve and a lovely face, and rode that invention to the heights of power before it set her down, gently and quietly, in a small American room at the end. One imprisoned, one freed, one forever reinventing, and yet beneath the three different roads ran the same single truth, the one this whole evening has been circling, that beauty is a kind of borrowed crown, dazzling while it sits on the brow, and certain, always certain, to be handed back. What each woman did in the brief blazing season she wore it, that was the only part that was ever truly hers. And there is a tenderness in seeing them so, all their noise and scandal and tragedy long stilled now, all the admirers and the emperors, and the crowds turned to dust with them. The faces that stopped rooms and toppled thrones are gone, as every face goes. What remains is only the story, the human truth of three women who were given the world's adoration and discovered, each in her own way, how little adoration finally weighs against a life. They are at rest now, all three, beyond the looking and the judging and the slow terror of the glass. And so, soon, will you be, drifting down past their quiet faces into a sleep where no one is watching, and no verdict is pending, and you are lovely or plain or anything at all to no one but the gentle dark. And there our journey ends for tonight. We began the evening at a dressing table, painting and lacing and poisoning ourselves into perfection, and we leave it in the company of 3 women who carried that same dangerous gift to the very edges of the world: Castiglione, who let her beauty become her tomb; Jane Digby, who made hers a road to freedom; and Lola Montez, who built a whole self out of nerve and a lovely face and very nearly got away with it. Each of them adored. Each of them, in the end, alone with the truth that a face is a fragile thing to build a life upon. So let the candles burn down now, and the mirrors grow dark, and the lovely painted faces of the past fade gently into the shadows where they rest. There is nothing left to perform tonight, no one left to charm, no glass left to search for the first faint line. You may set it all down, the looking, the judging, the endless work of being seen, and simply be, here in the warm dark, exactly as you are, which is enough. Think, if it soothes you, of how little any of it weighs in the end: the gowns and the diamonds, the painted faces and the turning heads, the emperors and the ballrooms and the long anxious hours before the glass. All of it is gone now, every gem and every glance, carried off by the same gentle tide that carries off all our days. The most beautiful woman in Europe lies as quietly tonight as the plainest maid who ever laced her stays. And there is a deep and restful kindness in that thought, if you let it settle over you, that the race we run after loveliness and approval and the admiration of the watching world is a race that no one finally wins or loses, because the finish line dissolves for all of us alike into the same soft dark you are sinking into now. You do not have to be beautiful tonight. You do not have to be admired, or accomplished, or anything at all. You have only to rest, and to breathe, and to let the warm quiet hold you, while the lovely ghosts of the past keep their silent company at the edge of the firelight, asking nothing of you as you drift. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink into the pillows. Let the soft dark settle over you like a blanket drawn up to your chin. The bright, anxious, glittering world can wait until morning. It always does. Sleep now. Rest easy, wherever you are, whatever the hour. And when you're ready, drift off gently into your own quiet dreams. I'll be here again tomorrow night, with another story from the soft, candlelit past, to keep you company in the dark. Until then, sweet dreams.